Hey everyone, welcome back to Choosers of the Slain. This is Lucas.
And this is Nate.
We have a lot to talk about this week. We had some daily updates coming in from the Warhammer Twitch stream and the community website, warhammercommunity.com. Just a bunch of really interesting information. Them just kind of breaking down some of the finer details on the bullet points that they mentioned in the initial reveal and the Q&A that followed. We kind of wanted to talk today about some of the stuff we learned and our thoughts on those things. First I wanted to kind of kick it off just saying there's a lot of really cool information about that Crusade
Oh yeah, there
system
is.
that they're adding to narrative, but there's so much that's going to be coming in the codexes and things like that I don't know that there's a whole lot of reason to discuss it yet until we get more information specifically about how it plays, other than that it just sounds like an awesome way to do escalation leagues or
hmm
like slow grow kind of things or campaigns at home. So I think that that's awesome. And if we don't seem to talk a lot about it, it's not because we don't think it's cool. It's just that seems so deep that without more specifics, I don't know that there's a lot to say.
Yeah,
Would you agree?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I know I'll definitely be starting up a Crusade army at some point, just from what I've seen. But until we know more about how it's going to work and everything like that, there's not much we can speculate on. So the most we can say is, yeah, seems cool. Can't wait to see more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
And I keep having like little fever dreams about a growing dreadnought collection of every time a cool character dies in my Crusade army, making a dreadnought for him.
Heck yeah.
So that said, if we move on to kind of the more match play stuff, because I
hmm
know a lot of you out there like hearing us talk about tactics and things like that. Just kind of the brief headers of the things that they talked about and that we're going to discuss here. They went into command points a bit and how detachments are going to work and how that impacts command points. There was also a handful of missions that were leaked, and that was really cool information.
Yeah.
Also, with that was table sizes, how some things are set up with measurements, things like that, and then a new addition to the battle round phases. So, kind of to start there, let's go to that battle round phase piece because that's kind of like a core mechanic.
hmm
How it impacts just the general gameplay. So what it appears is that we're seeing something kind of similar to maybe Age of Sigmar, where the battle round is now going to go command phase, movement phase, psychic phase, shooting phase, charge, fight, morale, and that command phase is that new piece. So what were your takeaways from some of the cool stuff that came about talking about this new command phase?
So I I thought that when they added the hero phase to Age of Sigmar and changed how hero abilities and everything worked, I thought it was a great change to the game. I thought it made a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it just added a really kind of unique flair to how your general's leading the battle. So I'm excited to see how this plays out in 40k, especially
Absolutely.
with the kind of the revelations that happened later in the week that different missions are going to interact with the command phase differently.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's regenerating CP or certain things are going to happen in the command phase, or I think one of the missions we saw was at the end of your command phase, you declare that you're taking this action, and then at the end of your next command phase, that's when it completes. I feel like it really adds an element of kind of strategic thinking and strategic play that wasn't necessarily there before, or that there weren't quite as many levers to pull, and so they added
Mm-hmm.
another lever and went, okay, so now it's another thing that you can do, and there's another phase that gives you a little more flexibility and gives you a little more room to be tactical.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it adds just some depth to the game. Not
hmm
only does it create room for more mechanics that make the game more interesting, but also for on like the competitive side of it, unless there is a prohibition in the command phase against doing things,
hmm
it also adds an extra phase for just the tactical. I don't want to say shenanigans, but like if you have certain stratagems that create like a permanent effect in game,
Mm-hmm.
it adds another phase to the game with which you can use a stratagem, because stratagems typically are limited to once per phase.
Right.
So it just kind of gives you a little bit more room, more headspace to interact with the game in a way that allows you to kind of flex your tactics a little bit.
Yep.
The action piece that you talked about is my favorite part of
Yes.
of this. It adds not only kind of like an immersion slash story element to the tactical side of the gameplay, and meaningful choices are awesome, and having to pick like, okay, I invested points in this unit for it to fight, but now I could get victory points from performing this action.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is awesome because it just adds more breadth to how you have to chew on the game that you're playing.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I like about it is that it adds value to units that are not necessarily as efficient at killing.
Right.
And that, when the game is entirely, I put a unit on the table so that it can punch the other guy in the face, then the only thing that really matters for unit efficiency is how long will it live and how many wounds per points does it put out.
Right.
And the units that may have looked inefficient in normal quote unquote 40k, with these actions added, I'll speak for my own army.
Mm-hmm.
Crusaders are really tempting looking at these new missions, because okay, I have these little 13-point dudes that have a 3+ invuln save that can come in units of 6, and their models are not huge, so getting behind blocking line of sight terrain is not too terribly hard.
Right.
I may start running a unit or two of Crusaders just to run around and plant flags and pull levers and disarm bombs and whatever it is the mission actions are, because my battle sisters can then focus on their job.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the current edition of 40k, I'm not really interested in including Crusaders because, frankly, not to sound like a that guy player, but they don't do enough for the points I spend when it comes to murder.
Right. And I mean, we've talked about that before on the show, that there's just the Sisters Codex is a great example of, there are 3 units that all compete for basically the same function, and only one of them really is as good as it needs to be.
Absolutely. Or like say, Death Cult Assassins is another Sisters example. Like they have a higher movement rate. Like, what, if the mission is run to this objective and then sit on it while you're doing something, a faster moving 5+ invuln save unit may have value again.
Right.
And so I'm just really excited about that, because it makes units have value aside from their ability to put out damage.
Yep.
And that's super intriguing to me. Also, the fact that missions are going to become more than just, there is a dot on the map that if you stand close to it, it turns into points. Because no matter what the stories and things are for the various missions, what it basically boils down to is there are dots on the map, and if you stand close enough to them, you get victory points, and then aside from that, shoot guys.
Right.
And it, there's variations on that theme, but having these actions actually kind of makes it feel like, the mission's not just called the 4 pillars.
Right.
I'm actually going to these 4 pillars and channeling energy from an ancient device, because I have to, do something. And it adds that kind of almost real-time strategy feeling, like, back in Dawn of War, Warcraft, Starcraft, or whatever, where you had to send a unit to a thing on the map and right-click it, and then you'd see your unit kneel down and a cooldown timer would start. It adds that feel to the game, where it's not just I'm sliding plastic men around and trying to murder the other guy. I'm just super excited about that.
Right. I
could probably soapbox for another half an hour and I'll stop now. But I'm really excited about actions and how they interact with the command phase.
Yeah. I'm really interested to see, and I think the 4 Pillars mission is a great example of sort of how that's getting used in the command phase and everything, that you have the potential to score a lot of points if you're using your actions wisely, and you really build your list to be more about objectives than necessarily about killing. That, I think that's kind of my takeaway in a lot of ways, is it almost seems like now your list doesn't just have to be built based around what's going to kill stuff the best. Like there's this element of not only, okay, so what's going to let me kill stuff, but you get to balance that against what's going to get the job done. I mean, Four Pillars is a great example where, sure, there are the secondary objectives that we can dive into, and there's a specific one for the Four Pillars mission that's literally you can have 4 units not do anything for a turn and just siphon power from the objectives, and it scores you 10 victory points, which is as much as controlling 2 or more objective markers for a turn.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a very different kind of play than control 2 objective markers and also kill your opponent, but you're not getting victory points for killing your opponent. Like it almost seems like a defensive play becomes more viable at that point.
Yeah, definitely.
Which
it also deepens. And I'm sorry to cut you off there, but
you're good.
It also deepens board control, because
Yes.
board control is not just about having high movement and being able to survive, one round of shooting, or being able to survive 1 counter charge or whatever. It's not just let me throw 5 dudes in a venom and fly them 20 inches across the table and I got 2 victory points.
Yeah.
Now board control is movement and endurance, and also efficiency, because if to get the movement and the endurance, you spend a lot of points on that unit, and then it doesn't attack, all the points you spent on its weapons and its strength weren't very efficiently spent. So now you have to look at your codex and go, what's tough and fast, but I'm not paying a premium for damage.
Right.
There's just more, like we've said 100 times in our various episodes, meaningful choices make the game better.
Yeah.
And I'm excited about this.
Yeah. I mean, looking at it, you mentioned, your Death Cult Assassins and your Crusaders and everything from the Eldar side of things. I'm seeing my my Wind Rider jet bikes with just the twin shuriken catapults potentially seeing the board again if their points value stays pretty low, because you don't pay much for the catapults and they're really fast and at least sticky enough to be able to be annoying if you're trying to pull them off an objective when they're performing an action, or things like Swooping Hawks or the new what do they call them, the Taraxi Sky Stalkers or whatever the AdMech unit is, things that can do damage in your movement phase.
Yep.
When your action happens at the end of the movement phase, that all of a sudden becomes a lot more valuable, because sure, you're giving up their shooting, but they still did their thing that they pay for in the movement phase and got to do the action. And with those 2 units in particular, they're not slow. They have pretty solid movement speeds. So it's, there's a lot of depth there that I'm really looking forward to seeing play out.
Well, I'm, speaking of Eldar, I'm wondering if this is going to put warp spiders back on the map.
Oh, I hope so. I love warp spiders so much, and they just have not done their job. Yeah.
Well, and since the warp spider spam crisis of 7th edition, with the ITC terrain exploit that they could do, they pretty much have been functionally, unfortunately, garbage.
Yeah.
And but now, if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I've had an Eldar army of my own, but they wear heavy aspect armor, right?
They do. Yep.
So they have the 3+ save.
Yep.
So you have this quote unquote fly, even though they're teleporters, but you have this like fly unit with a 3+ armor save. It's able to teleport onto an objective and start planting a flag, and then weather incoming shots way better than other, just stuff like that.
Yeah.
A unit like them, or if we were to look at like Harlequins, for instance.
Oh yeah.
Just the maneuverability and invuln saves that our Harlequins have, seeing them do more than just charge straight at the enemy like a really brightly colored orc army will be interesting, because they have things to do. I don't know. I'm so excited about this.
Yeah.
And we've talked a bit about missions and things like that. So I think that's a good segue into discussing like the missions and table size.
Yeah.
Because they gave an example. We talked about 4 pillars a little bit, but they also gave an example of one of the combat patrol missions, which is sized for the smaller games, the 500 point, level game.
Yeah.
And we've both made a lot of little observations about the layout things in the missions, and you mentioned one of them in our talk right before we started recording about where things are measured from. So you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah. So, and they mentioned this in one of the videos, but we both had kind of brought this up prior to the article going up, and at one point prior to one of the videos too, that it looks like everything now is getting measured from the center of the battlefield instead of from the edges of the battlefield, which from a design perspective makes a lot of sense. It's a lot easier, especially if you don't have the luxury of having a 4x6 table or whatever standard size gaming table you want to use. If the missions are designed based on the edges, then you have to have that size or things get kind of weird. But if the missions are designed based on the center and you're measuring everything from the center, none of the math needs to change. If you're using something that is at least the minimum size of the board that they're recommending, then all you do is you're adding a little extra room on the edges, and that doesn't nearly affect the game as drastically.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested to see how that plays out. And you pointed out the correlation between the board size and the kill team boards.
Oh yeah. Yep, that was something that I'm a member of a handful of competitive Facebook groups, and one of the top AdMech players, Rickert Nielsen, hoping I'm saying his last name right, like almost immediately pointed out, like, hey, if you count the squares on the map, it looks like these table sizes are going to be like 44 by 60 instead of 48 by 72. What's up with that? And it sparked a huge conversation in that Facebook group about, oh, well, you're reading too much into it, or whatever. They're not going to move away from the 4x6 foot table thing. And I was like, hey guys, Kill Team and Warcry are played on a 22 by 30 inch board, and they sell boards for those. Maybe there's a thing here. And then a couple days later, they post the game sizes are all evenly divisible by 22 by 30.
Yep.
I was like, it's almost like they were planning this.
Yeah. The and that kind of, it plays into something that they've said now a couple times on their various preview streams that they've been doing, that they're working really hard to improve the accessibility of the game, and that not only pulls in terms of the board size and being able to get to the normal size and the kill team size and utilize things that are a little more easily accessible than either going out and making your own foam board or buying a Realm of Battle board or something like that, but also the minor points increase that they're talking about, to make the game go a little bit faster and not have quite as many models on the board at a given time. Just increasing that accessibility, which from a design perspective, again, I think is great. From the perspective of a player and someone who likes to see more people play, that's fantastic to see too. And from a business perspective, it's a smart move. I mean, it's just, we can pretty comfortably say that was one of the things that really killed Warhammer Fantasy, was it got to the point where it was just so expensive and difficult to get into the game at a normal, like what people considered a normal point value. And so to be able to scale that back with 40K, because we were starting to get to that point where things were just, you're seeing a standard 2,000 point army, even for a fairly elite army like Space Marines, where you're fielding 50 or 60 troops or 50 or 60 infantry models. It starts to get excessive. So I'm glad to see that they kind of went, let's rein it in a little bit. Let's try to avoid 5-hour 2,000 point games.
Yeah, that it's definitely, I think, a good thing overall, because the points being relative, it doesn't hurt anybody to do this, because say you enjoy those bigger, longer games, and maybe you only want to play one game a weekend and you want it to take 9 hours or whatever, all you have to do is play more points. Like this solution streamlines like competitive, quick, like just, square off, play a game 40K and doesn't do anything to diminish. If you want to play that many models out of your collection, just agree with somebody to play an onslaught game, which is what I believe they're calling the 3,000 point level of the game.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this is something that I think is absolutely brilliant on their part. There are some subtle imbalances in the game that have just historically existed because of the very nature of how the rules setup works, where shooting armies are low risk, low reward, or at times low risk, high reward, depending on the codex that you're playing. And assault armies are at best moderate risk, moderate reward, and sometimes high risk, high reward, because the assault phase, you can't interact with the enemy without consequence.
Right.
In the shooting phase, with the very rare exceptions of things like what the Inari could do a soul burst for a little while, or maybe 2 or 3 bespoke rules in the game, what your shooting phase is carried out without consequence.
Right.
And so inherently, assault armies have some difficulties where, to do the thing that they do well, they have to risk themselves in a way that shooting armies don't.
Yeah.
And the Games Workshop over the years has tried to balance that with getting more bang for your buck when you fight in close combat than maybe when you shoot. And that's why some of the craziest things that can happen in the game happen in that like bloody, visceral close combat, which also has like a narrative cinematic feel to it. And it makes sense when you look at it, kind of, broad strokes, but in the game, it doesn't always feel good.
Right.
When, you bring a Space Wolves army or an Orc army and you square off with an opponent who, is making a wise tactical decision. And I'm not throwing these people under the bus at all, but they see like, oh, you're running all Wolfen Space Wolves, or you brought like a Green Tide Orc army. Cool. Well, I won the roll off, so I'm going to pick Hammer and Anvil, and I'm going to deploy all of my Basilisks or Hammerheads or Wyverns or whatever, what have you, right on the back board edge. And you're going to have to walk across 90 inches of open field while I just pound you off the table. And we've said before in some of these conversations that 9th edition appears to be about eliminating the feel bad moments.
Yeah.
And when you've put all that love and energy into an army that just isn't a gunline army, and you show up and with a single die roll, your opponent can make a tactical choice, which is a good tactical choice, that cuts off one of your legs, it doesn't feel good. And the smaller, even though these table mission size things are just a minimum and you can play the game on whatever you want, the competitive community is going to do what the book says, because that's how the mindset works. But also even the ITC Reese just recently straight up said, we will be using the 44 by 60 inch table sizes for the ITC. Like they have confirmed they will be using that thing, and they're already in the process of producing mats in that size for sale.
Ooh.
And so yes, I think that this is an aside. I'm kind of wandering off my point a second, but I have a feeling that Games Workshop, quote unquote, going to war with the other formats of organized play was maybe not as hostile as it came across in their pitch. I have a feeling, because all these play testers know each other.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that they've all known the score, and it's been a collaborative move. And Games Workshop from a face-saving public relations standpoint gets to kind of swagger a little bit and act like, yeah, we're swinging for the fences and we're going to take everything down and it's going to be amazing. And I think everybody's like, yeah, that's because we're letting you do it,
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, the ITC has already officially stated it's going to toe the line.
Okay.
So kind of back to where I was going with that little soapbox there is that this is a really brilliant way for Games Workshop to help balance assault armies. Because if the table shrinks even slightly, a couple inches shaved off of no man's land here, or a couple inches, or well, in some instances, half a foot shaved off of where you can hide from my chain axe. Really, it's a way to give assault armies a better chance of crossing the table to do their job without having to increase their movement rate or increase their armor saves or increase their, it's a a really, really ingenious way in my mind of balancing that eternal struggle
Yeah.
between gun lines and assault armies without actually changing model stats. And I was like, when I saw the slightly smaller table, I was like, oh, maybe this is just my eyes as an orc player and were I a battle sister, I'd probably very quickly end up being a Repentia. Um, the I saw it from that perspective and was just like, oh, No Man's Land just got 2 inches shorter. Ooh.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I was really happy with that.
And it depends on the board too. And this was kind of the other thing that, at least in the missions we've seen, it looks like this is the case. And I'm curious if it will stay that way. I can't recall offhand, but I think Age of Sigmar works this way, where each mission has a predefined deployment pattern.
Yes, I believe it was in the Tuesday Q&A right after the announcement that Stu Black said bespoke deployment maps.
Did he? Okay, I didn't catch that. So that I'm looking forward to that, because it gives them a little more license to tailor each individual mission to be better balanced. I mean, I know we've played games, and I'm sure just about everybody has played games where it's like, okay, we rolled up whatever this mission is that has 2 objectives, and then we added, we decided the deployment map was going to be something that makes it so half the game is spent ignoring the objectives. Like, it's just, I'm really excited to see that each mission is going to have its own deployment map, so that way it's more cohesive. It feels like a mission. It doesn't feel like a random set of parameters that got thrown together at the beginning of the game. So that, I think that'll be really cool to see, and I think it'll be good for balancing, gunline versus assault armies too. Because if it's a mission where there's advantage for the gunline army, they can set up the deployment map so that way it's not 24 inches of no man's land, it's 18 inches of no man's land. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think of everything we've seen so far, what they've revealed about how missions will work and secondary objectives and how actions will interface with the missions and all that, it's probably what I'm most excited about thus far.
The thing that I was very excited about, speaking of that, in seeing the new missions, were those secondaries. Seeing that, kind of taking that nod from the way the ITC missions work, but maybe sticking to the good parts of the idea and not getting as convoluted. I think is looking great. I mean, we haven't seen all of the secondaries yet, but just the idea that they're not a bunch of pre-game list chewing kind of like, I like the idea of the ITC secondaries, but like to have to go, well, I need to select 4 units from my opponent's army that have a power level greater than 8. And like that, there's just a lot of bookkeeping to it that adds like a almost too much meta level thinking to the whole concept. And the little teases we've gotten from the secondaries that GW has added to their missions, they seem pretty characterful, interesting, like they'll affect the game, but they're also pretty straightforward. And I love the idea of faction-based secondaries. So instead of there being one menu, I'm thinking, the AdMech, which I love, have a stratagem called Acquisition at Any Cost, which gives bonuses to somebody who's sitting on an objective as a stratagem. But like that's kind of like a philosophy that the army has. So I would like to see that move from the stratagems to a secondary, where, an AdMech unit can spend an action on an objective to get victory points, and maybe, who knows, maybe like a one-use item or something, or whatever the way they decide to play those things out.
Right.
I don't know. I think it's really neat. And I think it's more interesting than there just being a menu of 30 of them that everybody is picking from.
Yeah, and the other thing that I really like about that, and it sounded like it was going to work not only with secondaries but also with your primary objectives, is this idea that you can cap out on victory points,
Yeah.
and that at some point, if you're doing really well, the game turns from I'm just going to keep doing my thing and churning out victory points to, okay, I've completed my objectives. Now I need to stop my opponent from completing theirs.
Yes.
And so I think in terms of list building and sort of meaningful choices and everything during the game, that puts you into a place where you're saying, okay, so if I am essentially unopposed, I could cap out on my victory points by turn 3, for instance. So that gives me 2 turns to try and keep my opponent from scoring victory points. And can my list, if it's capping out on turn 3, can it also keep my opponent from capping out in those 3 turns? And your list build turns into this more of a strategic, like, where is that balance? Where is the point
Yeah.
where I'm going, okay, I can do the things I want to do, but I also need to be able to run interference.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking forward to see how that plays out, because I think some of the secondary objectives, it's going to be really tough to interfere with. And so it's going to make for some close and interesting interactions between lists. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am. I don't know. I just think there's so many positive things I have to say about it, and I don't want to sound like I am just drinking the Kool-Aid and that oh, everything is going to be great. I mean, I'm
Right.
sure there's going to be some challenges and some adjustments,
Yeah.
and there may be some folks that experience a little bit of frustration because how they need to their fundamental interaction with the game
Uh-huh.
may change from what they're comfortable with, and that's going to be an adjustment for anybody.
Uh-huh.
But I think really I personally am willing to take them at their word that their intention is like we're trying to do essentially what the community asked for.
Yeah.
We're 9th edition is 8th, knowing what we know now.
Yep.
And addressing the complaints that have come up over the last 3 years. And I think that things like having the points kind of almost universally increase across the board.
Mm-hmm.
It makes games faster. It makes games a little bit smaller, and that's cool. And you can, like I said earlier, you can end round that by just increasing the size of your games if you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing it allows them to do is finer tune control.
Yep.
Because the more points that are quote unquote in play, the more settings on the dial there are to like really, really tune in to where a unit should be.
Yep.
So now you don't run into, if you have 2 units that maybe one needs to increase in cost by 4%, and another unit needs to increase in cost by 7%.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the points, they cost the same now. And if you add 1 point to each, that's maybe a 10% increase. And now one unit is wildly overcosted and the other unit is about where it should be. There's just not enough room for them to move.
Yep.
And those little changes, while each individual one might be uncomfortable, like how missions are being done or how they're adding a command phase and adding actions where some of your units now have to do things instead of shooting or instead of fighting. Like some of those things might be uncomfortable, but overall, I'm just so happy with how this is going to positively impact the game, in my opinion, across the board.
Yeah.
So I'll take a little bit of discomfort in several areas in exchange for a game that's overall just healthier. And that's what I'm excited about. You had just talked about how it's going to have to change how you approach things in the list build.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of plays into a big part. And I say this with all the love in my heart, a big part of the salt that we're seeing online.
Yeah.
When it comes to players' discomfort with things is how you build your army, detachments, and command points.
Oh gosh.
We'll take a moment here so that everyone can start screaming at their screens. And okay, so
pour one out for the Loyal 32.
Yep.
There we go. All right.
So what we have learned is that Now the detachments are largely going to stay what we know them as. There is going to be patrol, battalion, brigade, and then your specialty detachments such as Spearhead or Vanguard, Outrider, those things.
Mm-hmm.
They have not listed everything, or we don't know that all detachments have survived the change. We also don't know what new detachments might appear,
Mm-hmm.
but something that we do know for certain is that they cost you command points. So we're kind of going back in the direction of older editions where there was just the combined arms detachment, where if you build your army out of a single detachment and that detachment happens to be one of the core,
Mm-hmm.
which they described as patrol, battalion, and brigade,
Mm-hmm.
and you include your warlord in that detachment, you get refunded the command point costs for it, and it is functionally free.
Yep.
Every other detachment costs, even if it is your first one. So, you can run those Belial and a billion Deathwing Terminator armies if you'd like. You're just going to pay a command point or two for every detachment of them. And since command points are now a fixed finite resource
Mm-hmm.
across all armies based on the size of the game, actually using all elite, all specialist, no flaw, having all my gaps are covered armies is actually going to cost you instead of reward you.
Yep.
And there is a lot of, how do I politely say, posterior pain
Yeah.
about not being able to milk the system.
So it's interesting you mentioned the Deathwing with Belial and all that, because that also brings up a change that maybe I'm not remembering my battalion detachment very well, but I'm pretty sure in 8th edition a battalion was 2 to 3 troops, 2 to 3 HQ, 3 to 6 troops, and then 0 to 3 elite, fast, and heavy. And
Correct.
Then you could have
and
like up to 2 flyers.
Yeah.
So one thing that they didn't really call out is that in 9th edition a battalion detachment gives you 0 to 6 elites.
Interesting.
So your Belial, your Belial in the Deathwing, or your Grandmaster Voldus and a bunch of paladins or whatever, doesn't necessarily cost you more command points. You just still have the troop tax.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of an interesting look, and maybe it's a typo, but considering it looks like it's pulled directly from the asset that would be included in the book, I'm guessing that this is how it actually works. And in that case, your battalion, as long as you meet your minimums, you can have 6 elites in a battalion detachment, which is nice to see. But the other thing that they kind of talked about with that, and that we had revealed there, was that dedicated transports are now just for infantry. You can't take 3 tanks and then take 3 tanks to transport the tanks.
I don't know why. Like, a tankception was a thing,
Right?
man.
I'm gonna put my Lemon Russ in a Chimera because reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, I mean, the exhibit helped write the detachment rules for 8th edition.
right.
Yo, dog, I heard you like repressors, so now you can repress things while you're repressing things in your repressor.
Exactly.
But the thing that I'm excited about, though, is, like, say you do want to run. We'll stick with the Dark Angels example.
Mm-hmm.
Say you do want to run that same Terminator list that you could do with the battalion that you just talked about. You can save the points on that troop tax, and all it's going to cost you is probably 2 or maybe 4, because they haven't said the prices specifically yet.
Yeah.
But say they just kind of reverse the benefits, for sake of argument, let's just reverse the benefits that you got from detachments in 8th edition, which, based on what they did show, looks kind of consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And based on their Q&A, they did refer to adding a knight to any Imperial army would cost you 1 or 2 command points.
Yeah.
So if it is just a reversal, and we say that the Vanguard detachment, which is 1 headquarter and 3 elites, and up to 2 additional elites, say that costs you a command point. If you run 2 Vanguards, you're looking at paying probably 2, command points for 2 HQs and 6 elites.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that, oh, GW is taking away my command points to let me run the army that I want. Like, no, you just had to make the meaningful choice, as we said before, between, do I want to pay the troop tax of having to include 3 troop choices, or do I want to just throw a couple command points away to buy off that troop tax? And that's a choice that you have to make as the tactician of, do I need that resource? Will those troops be beneficial? Or because I want to play this narrative, kind of story-driven army that is just, this is a task force of all Deathwing, what am I willing to tactically give up to keep that narrative immersion?
Yep.
And I think that's amazing. I think that's a great system, and I like this way more. But I totally understand, people got used to a way to do things. And so there's definitely going to be discomfort in that. But one thing I personally kind of quipped to somebody just recently at the shop, when was the last time you saw a detachment actually filled out? It's almost like, it's almost like in 8th edition, a battalion is not 2 to 3 headquarters, 0 to 3 elites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A battalion is 2 headquarter, 3 troops, end of line. And, unless somebody hit their 3 detachments for the army, any additional units you built, you just put into another, oh, well, I want to add 3 tanks. I'm just going to put those in a spearhead. I want to add 3 fast attacks. I'm not going to put them in one of my battalions. I'm going to put them in unless you are specifically farming chapter tactics for things, there was no reason not to add an additional detachment, because you would get more command points. And to actually see now a reason to fill out the battalion before moving on to a second feels, and maybe this is me showing my age, but that feels a lot more 40K to me, because I spent decades going, I have 1 detachment. It is called Combined Arms, and it starts at, 1 HQ and 2 troops, and it goes up to 2, or what was up to 2 or 3 HQs and 3 elites, and up to 6 troops and 3 fast attack and 3 heavy support. And that was it. Unless you were playing a specific special mission that had its own, like if you were playing a raid mission, or if you were playing a siege mission, or because the various editions all had their alternate mission types. And unless you were playing one of those alternate mission types, the detachment chart didn't change. A 2,000 point army had to fit into the Combined Arms detachment. And so there is a degree of like going home that this feels like for some of us. I think it's great. And I think that it'll be a way for armies to still have the freedom to make, you can make whatever army you want. If you want to run an army where you don't have to bring troops because you just want to run all elites, you can. You just have to pay. And I think that's good for the health of the game.
So I think the other thing too, and this is, I can't say for sure, but just based on what I've seen in a few different communities, this is probably an unpopular opinion, but I think in some ways this is Games Workshop's way of saying, hey, so if you have a list that requires you to spend 18 command points by the end of turn 2 for it to be successful, that's not the kind of list we want to encourage. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because every one of those lists that I've seen, it's not this is fun and flavorful, and it relies on these command points because it does some cool stuff, and it lets me do fancy things with the way I move units or whatever. Like, it's almost invariably, I use the same stratagem as much as possible, and I use very specific tactics, and it's not about making choices and playing back and forth. It's, I have a list of things I go through, and if I check all my boxes, as long as my dice agree with me, I win.
It's that hammer blow crushing alpha strike.
I mean, it's a problem that I've seen plenty of times in the competitive Magic the Gathering scene too, where for a while at least, and I've been out of it for quite a while now, but for a while, the meta had basically turned into it doesn't matter what deck your opponent brings unless it's the rock to your scissors. What your opponent does doesn't really matter because your deck is just designed to play the same way regardless.
Mhm.
And I know Wizards of the Coast didn't like that and has tried to make changes, but it's been a tough thing to do. And I think to an extent we were starting to see 40K, the 40K competitive meta function that way, especially with the pre-nerf Iron Hands and that sort of thing, where it just turned into, it doesn't really matter what you do. It's not an interaction thing at this point. It's a, do the dice agree with what I'm trying to do? If so, I win. If not, well, who gets there first?
Well, there was maybe not everybody shared this thought, but at the beginning of 8th, when they announced that stratagems were going to be a thing, mm-hmm. and that some of the factions, various like characterful abilities, were moving off of data sheets into the stratagems because they wanted there to be like a finite resource so that you had to make choices about when does your faction do its cool thing. I thought that was a really, really good thing for the not only the narrative immersion, but also just for the tactical balance of the game. Because then if you had armies that were these like, Death Watch Custodes, you had these armies that were supposed to be these super elite things. Having a finite resource govern that kept their cooler abilities in check. But then the competitive meta figured out how to milk every command point, the most efficient way possible to almost undo that change and return it to each faction is doing its coolest thing every turn.
Yeah.
And then while it's doing that, it is also having I don't even know that it was a vocal minority, but there was a vocal cohort, which I think was probably a majority, complaining about how Feel Bad Z's crazy alpha strikes feel.
Yep.
And so you're like, okay, well, so the community has found a workaround to undo one of the major points of stratagems and command points in the first place, and then frustrated by the consequences of those actions.
Yep.
And then now that Games Workshop is kind of dialing it back and going, you know what? Not only did it not work the way we intended, but we also understand that you're accustomed to this way. So here is a compromise. I mean, Stu himself said that what they did for the chart for command points, which they have posted, by the way, the chart for command points was we looked at the average command points that most competitive lists were generating and then rounded it up a little bit. And that was what they went by. I mean, they basically went, okay, double battalion was the thing. And occasionally you'd see a brigade, but generally it was double battalion, which would be 10. I'm not counting the 3 Battleforged because we'll get to those command points in a second. But so then what did they do for a 2,000 point game? 12. So they looked at either, most competitive lists had a brigade or a double battalion. So they gave you the brigade command points, which was the higher of the two. And, yes, you lost the 3 command points for your army being Battleforged, but there is a rule in the game that's being added to the core rules that if your army is Battleforged, you gain 1 command point per command phase.
Yep.
And that's not mission specific. That is a core game rule. So unless something bespoke turns it off over the course of a 4 to 6 turn game, Battleforged is now paying you 4 to 6 command points instead of 3. So the average 2,000 point army is actually coming out 2 to 3 command points ahead.
Yep.
But because you don't have access to them all on turn 1, as I referred to earlier, there is discomfort.
Yes. Yes.
And I think them switching that the Battleforged bonus to a constant income, I think also reflects that they're like, hey, some armies, it's in their fluff or it's in their tactical doctrine to kind of try to lash out for an alpha strike, but the games are supposed to last 4 to 6 turns.
Right.
They're not supposed to last 2.
Right.
And the command point economy and the balance of the stratagems worked in a large portion of competitive 8th is by the end of turn 2 the game was decided.
Yeah.
And turn 3 and 4 was just the underdog's Hail Mary attempt to even the playing field, to scratch out a draw or to maybe sucker punch their enemy and come out a point or two ahead. But with very rare exception. I mean, I know that I think Jim Vessel did it a few times, but I know that wow, I'm blanking on the gentleman's name. Our Iron Hands champion. Why can I not remember his name? The gentleman who just won LVO with the Brohammer Iron Hands army.
Yeah.
And I apologize to everyone for just totally mind blanking on his name. His list could kind of like play the slow game and just steadily gain victory points across the board. But generally speaking, in most games, you knew who won by the end of turn 2.
Yeah.
Because everybody just swung for the fence on turn 1, and that was all she wrote. You just look at the kind of tide of battle at that point. You're like, okay, the rest of the game is just going through the motions.
Yeah, it's all over but the crying.
Yeah, and to have a good, to have a sizable number of your command points trickle in over the course of the game instead of just all front loaded at the very beginning of the game. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. I think the change we're seeing is a good indicator that Games Workshop is, I don't know if pointing out is the right phrase, but is making it clear maybe that stratagems were intended to be a
Siegler.
What's that?
Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, you're okay.
Richard Siegler.
Oh yeah. Yep.
I apologize for interrupting everyone.
No, that's okay.
It's driving me nuts.
Yeah, I get that. I think what we're seeing too is that Games Workshop kind of is acknowledging that, or making it clear that stratagems are meant to be flavorful, special things that happen or are supposed to represent, resource investment that is made by the general, in this case, the person playing the army, and that in 8th edition, as the game went on, it turned more and more into just who could generate the most special stuff to do. And I think the intent was that they wouldn't have a huge effect on the game overall, that they would have they might affect one unit significantly at a time, but they wouldn't be, games wouldn't be won and lost purely based on planning to use stratagems regardless of what your opponent brought or that or what was going on the board at the time. But I think even without that, it's pretty clear that the effect of stratagems was it was probably a little too heavy, or because of how easy it was to get command points, you didn't have to be as careful with spending them. And so using stratagems lists were built around stratagems instead of built around units, and the stratagems were a bonus. And I think that was really evident in the fact that 2 of the often considered most powerful and most expensive and or restricted stratagems in the game were Agents of Vect and A Plan Generations in the Making, which were the stratagems that let you stop stratagems from working. And if the ability to stop a stratagem is worth twice as much as that stratagem on average is going to cost, if not 4 times as much as that stratagem is going to cost, I think that's a pretty good indicator that stratagems might have played a bigger role than they were really intended to. So
I would agree with that.
I think seeing this command point change, and I would not at all be surprised if we saw fewer stratagems in individual codexes, since there's going to be more core stratagems. And if they were if they were less, I don't want to say less impactful, but maybe less drastic. So I could see something like a one command point for your salamanders. You select a unit to shoot with flamers. You reroll wound rolls with the flamers, or something like that. But I would almost be surprised to see something that fits with a couple of stratagems we see in the game right now, where it's basically shoot your thing, all your sixes are mortal wounds for one, maybe two command points. I think we'll see less of that sort of thing as ninth progresses.
That may be definitely the case. Maybe definitely. Yeah, that's likely the case. That there's a word for that. I think too, one of the differences that we see between like competitive aggressive play and like really solid good tactical play is all of the nuance and the mastery of the movement phase and deployment and things that have nothing to do with stratagems. But right. Stratagems are kind of in a way like an easy button, like you were talking about. Yeah. And so you'll get some players that are really trying to up their competitive game, or maybe they're trying to play aggressively because winning is fun. And they just kind of formulate a checklist of, I do this, then I use the stratagem, then I do this, then I use this stratagem. And instead of their list being a synergistic tactical tool belt, it's almost like a fighting game's list of like commands for special moves.
Yeah.
Where it's combos. Like, okay, yeah, here is this unit. And if I use this stratagem, then this stratagem, then this stratagem, while they stand next to this character, I get to, shoot a fireball, or I get to do a backflip or whatever. And as opposed to, this unit can have an edge once or twice a game at the thing that it naturally does well. And so I think sometimes, and I don't want to try to paint things with too broad of a brush, but I think quite often, instead of looking at the game holistically as I need to deploy well, move well, use my abilities at the correct time, and then know, to borrow wisdom from the ancient great and late Kenny Rogers, but to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. Yep. Instead of having to master all of those things, it just becomes, these are my 6 good stratagems.
Yep.
I have built an economy around being able to use them for 2 turns in a row.
Yep.
And I look at this elite choice, and in my head I go, this elite choice deep strikes, moves directly towards their cool thing, and then does this combo and 100 hand slaps it into oblivion.
Yep.
And then after that, I don't care if the unit dies, because that's what its one-shot missile was for, as opposed to actually mastering, like, when do you drop it? Where do you move it? Give it a slight edge for a command point. It does its job. Now it fires and fades and, or it repositions tactically. The prevalence of the, like, judo chop of so many of the stratagems has reduced some, and I'm not saying the top tier players. I am not at all throwing, some of the greats under the bus in this category, but like people who approach the game from that competitive standpoint quite often are just throwing those haymakers.
Yeah.
And not actually, floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee, and I think that's the separation. That's the difference. Why you get a tournament of 800 people, and the same 12 of them are in the top 8 tables year after year
consistently. Yep.
Is because 8th edition kind of created, you have your bruisers, and then you have your actual martial artists,
right.
And I'd like to see the game ease back the throttle on that a little bit, so that it forces the fish that are just swimming in that aquarium of throw giant punches and I win and it forces them to learn to actually dance.
Yeah. Yeah.
So many
There's a
mixed
whole lot of metaphors.
Yeah. But I think that's what it comes down to for me, is that it is just it's almost too much of an easy mode.
Yeah. The thing that I've noticed as 8th edition goes on, and I know we've talked about this before, and I've seen it locally, I've seen it online, both in terms of lists, list reviews from tournaments, and also just from lists that I see get posted in the various communities I'm a part of. There is a strong attitude that has advanced over the course of 8th edition, where if you can't treat your list like a checklist as opposed to an army list, it's probably not good enough. And personally, I think that is a very unpleasant way to play the game, and I think that is not the intention of the designers, and I think they're making that pretty clear with the way that they're changing. Even just what we've seen so far seems to be trying to get away from that style of of list building, where you're just ticking off the boxes and saying, as long as I can check them all, it doesn't matter what else happens, because I've checked my boxes. And so that's, if I don't win at that point, it's either because the opponent checked their boxes faster, or they decided that I wasn't going to win. It just, kind of like you said, it adds this sort of, I guess, easy mode, where you're basically saying, I put in 2 quarters and out pops a dead unit.
Yep.
And I don't think that's what stratagems were meant to feel like. And I think if you look back critically over the course of 8th edition at how the erratas happened and how FAQs happened and how things were released, I think you see that that's probably not what the intention was. But the community, as any gaming community will, especially in a competitive setting, they found the advantages and they eked them out to the fullest extent. And I mean, that's not to say necessarily that that's a bad thing. It's not to pass judgment on people for doing that, because if you want to win, you find the best way to win and the most consistent way to win, and you win as best you can. But I don't know that it's healthy for the game, and I'm glad to see that Games Workshop has said, no, this isn't how we want the game to be played. This isn't how we intend it to be played. We're going to take an active role in designing it away from that kind of play.
Well, and too, with them saying that they're specifically going after the feel bad moments. The way some of the stratagems were realized in practice created not only feel bad moments for the victim, but sometimes the stratagems were so good but still relied on random number generation that it also created feel bad moments where you spend your 3 CP and then you get a poor die roll. And you're like, well, this is dumb. I paid my money. I want my ticket. And so then it also created feel bad moments for the attacker, who was, I'm imagining the scene from Army of Darkness way back when, of like, I said your words, I paid my CP. Now you let me home. But it's a 3 CP stratagem because it's really powerful, but it still is a roll a d6, and on this happens, and then you variably, that is when you roll a 1, and then you're in that position of, well, do I throw good money after bad because I could command point reroll that 1, but now that stratagem cost me 4 instead of 3, and and I think that overall I'm hoping that these changes do kind of reduce those feel bad moments. You're not dumping a finite resource into a shaky proposition, and your opponent also isn't constantly flinching because like, oh, you picked up some of your command points, what thing is gonna screw me out of a half an hour of fun now?
Yep.
Yep. So yeah,
there was almost a Monopoly feel to it in some games where it was like, oh great, I did my thing and I landed on Park Place, and guess who owns Park Place? Not me. Cool.
Yep. Oh, look, I'm out.
Yeah, great. I'm gonna go play a video game. Like it's just, it's one of those things where you don't want a war game like Warhammer to feel like Monopoly, exactly because Monopoly is the sort of game that you don't play with people that you want to stay friends with. Like, it's just, you want the game to feel like you're interacting and that you have a chance, and that you have fun regardless of whether you're winning or losing, because winning or losing is the outcome. But why spend 4 hours or 3 hours playing a game to not have fun for 2 of those 3 hours?
Oh yeah.
It just,
everyone's had that experience where they show up to a game and within 15 minutes of the game starting, they're like, okay, this is going to be one of those games where why did I show up?
Yep.
You're just like, oh, I just signed up for 3 hours of getting kicked in the teeth.
Yep. And sometimes it happens because of dice, and there's nothing you can do about that. But the thing that I'm happy to hear that they seem to be actively designing away from is it doesn't matter what your dice do. You showed up for this game and your opponent was already planning on kicking you in the teeth the entire time, regardless of what you did. It just, nobody wants to go up against the dentist immediately.
Ooh. It's like a new wargaming pejorative there.
I'm gonna make it a thing. That's my goal. We're gonna make it a thing.
We're gonna make it a thing. Okay.
Yep, I think
well,
it is.
As you all can see, we have tons of thoughts and we could talk forever about some of this stuff. But this was kind of our reactions to all the news that we got this week. There were a couple things that we didn't touch on. We didn't touch on Crusade. We didn't fully go into, in our stratagem conversation, we didn't talk about Cut Them Down, which is one of the new ways to deal with the frustration of putting all the work into finally getting into close combat and then the enemy just walks away. So I'm happy that they addressed that in a way that seems relatively balanced, but we can save that for a conversation for another time.
Yes.
Thank you all for sticking with us and listening to this.
Thanks everybody.
You were going to say?
I'm just going to say we've got another week of previews coming up here, so it'll be interesting to see what comes from the end of that.
Yeah, and like always, we will be here to give you our thoughts, and we invite you, if you feel like there's anything that we should have talked about that we didn't, or if you have any thoughts on the comments that we made, feel free to join us on Discord. We've had some lively discussions in there this week about Sisters of Battle lists and what's worth building and whatnot after our episode talking about the tactics of that. So join us. Jump into the Choosers of the Slain Discord and let us know what you think of what we talk about, and maybe we can steer things in the direction of what you're looking for. But we won't know unless you tell us.
Yep, exactly.
So y'all have an excellent week watching all your 40K dailies on Twitch or checking out the articles on Warhammer Community. And as always, I'm Lucas.
I'm Nate.
And we will be back on Choosers of the Slain when we have more to say.
Bye, everybody.